The daytime march on June 24, 1876 had been quite exhausting. We stopped frequently so the scouts could thoroughly scout the valley ahead. After we fed and groomed our horses and finished our simple meal of coffee and hardtack, the men spread their shelter tents and blankets on the ground and laid down for a much-needed rest. The chosen spot for our bivouac was among the most beautiful we had come across. To our right, a tall bluff rose almost vertically, creating a striking backdrop to the scene. Between the cliff and the river, a clear, calm stream flowed alongside a flat, grassy terrace about 200 yards across. The area was adorned with abundant wild rose bushes in full bloom and scattered trees, enhancing its picturesque park-like appearance. The riverbanks were lined with low willows and fragrant rose bushes, making it an ideal campsite that Custer often favored for its natural beauty. It felt particularly fitting that this spot, which turned out to be the last camp for so many, was so exceptionally beautiful. Since then, I've often hoped that someone might locate this spot and capture it in a photograph. But to continue, my troop, Troop A, was positioned quite near Custer's headquarters, marked by a single A tent. He sat there alone for a long time, lost in deep thought. As I lay on my side facing him, I wondered if it was my imagination or the fading light that cast a new sadness on his face. Perhaps his thoughts were drifting back to Fort Lincoln, where his beloved wife remained, and maybe he felt a foreboding about what lay ahead on the morrow. His contemplation was interrupted when several officers gathered at his tent for instructions. After the discussion ended, a number of younger officers stayed near one of their bivouacs, and I soon heard the mournful notes of Annie Laurie, followed by little footsteps, soft and gentle, and then the goodbye at the door, which ended with the doxology, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." It struck me as an intriguing collection of tunes for cavalrymen to sing on an Indian route. Could it have been a prayer whispered from the hearts of those young officers, many of whom had only recently graduated from West Point? Perhaps it was an unconscious feeling of foreboding about the tragic fate awaiting some of them so soon. But as the final words faded, they seemed to shake off their somber mood by adding, "For he's a jolly good fellow that nobody can deny." A somewhat irreverent touch, I thought at the time. Yet soldiers are not typically known for their religious reverence. After exchanging a few good nights, they sought their rest. An unusual quiet settled over the camp, interrupted only by the occasional sound of a horse's hoof or the call of a nocturnal bird. As we lay there in that peaceful bivouac in a part of the Indians' paradise land unfamiliar to us, it was hard to imagine that just a short distance away, a fierce battle had recently raged. Only a week prior, Crazy Horse had halted General Crook's advance with a much larger force than ours. No one could have foreseen that within a month, those same hostile forces, emboldened by yet another significant victory, would camp once more along this serene stream. They would soon be driven away by General Terry approaching from the north and General Crook from the south, following the trail we had just forged. Little did we anticipate that our current mission would circle back to this very spot, pursuing the same hostile force again. And within a few miles from where we rested, the brave and unyielding lame deer would soon sacrifice his life in defense of his right to live and hunt along this stream adorned with wild roses. His name would later echo in the agency set aside for his tribesmen. Our rest here was brief, lasting only a few hours, as around 10 o'clock we were roused and ordered to saddle up for a night march. Quickly mounting our horses, we followed the Rosebud for about 10 miles or more, climbing up the north fork of the river along the divide that separated it from the Little Bighorn. Around 2 a.m., we halted, awaiting word from the scouts sent ahead to locate the Indians' camp. Saddles were removed and many took the opportunity to catch a nap. As daylight broke, some brewed coffee, though the water was of poor quality and difficult to drink. Those not sleeping gathered in small groups, discussing the likelihood of a skirmish and puffing away on their pipes as usual. General Custer, who had advanced ahead to the divide where scouts had spotted smoke rising from the Indian village and seen pony herds grazing nearby in the valley some 12 or 15 miles distant, returned around 8 o'clock. He rode back bareback, and I believe bareheaded, to each troop, briefing the officers that the Indians had been located and announcing an immediate departure. Troops began saddling up quickly, and we were soon on our way up the Rosebud Little Bighorn divide. We pressed on until about 10:30 a.m., halting in a ravine roughly 4 or 5 miles from the divide summit. Here, we were instructed to remain concealed and maintain silence. According to Captain Godfrey, Custer planned to postpone the attack until the following morning. However, upon discovery of our presence by scouts and others, action became necessary, prompting us to resume our march and cross the divide shortly before noon. Shortly thereafter, the regiment was divided into battalions. The advance battalion, commanded by Major Reno, was made up of Troop M under Captain French, Troop A under Captain Moylan and Lieutenant DeRudio, and Troop G under Lieutenants McIntosh and Wallace. The Indian Scouts, about 30 in number, were led by Lieutenants Varnum and Hare, with 2 interpreters, Isaiah Dorman, who was black, and Frank Gerard, a half-breed. Additionally, there were 3 white scouts, Charlie Reynolds, George Herendine, and a guy named Barondot. The medical officers included Dr. DeWolf and Dr. Porter. The exact number of the battalion is not known, but it was likely just under 150 in total. Captain Bentine's battalion, comprising troops D, H, and K with around 125 men, moved to our left front. Meanwhile, General Custer, with troops C, E, F, I, and L, positioned on our right. The pack trains, escorted by Captain McDougal and Troop B, followed at the rear. Major Reno's brigade followed the Indian route down a valley that became known as Bentine's, or Sundance Creek. This creek typically flowed into the Little Bighorn River when there was water, but it was dry at that time. Along our route, we passed a funeral teepee containing the body of a warrior, which our Indian scouts had set on fire. We eventually discovered that the deceased was Circling Bear, Old She-Bear's brother, who had been killed in the battle with Crook on the Rosebud 8 days earlier on June 17th. It was reported that a few Indians were seen near here, keeping far enough ahead to avoid danger. Personally, I did not see any. As we neared the river, Reno received an order that made us quicken our pace. Soon, we reached the Little Bighorn, a stream about 50 to 70 feet wide and 2 to 4 feet deep, with clear, icy cold water. Our horses, and we being very thirsty, plunged in eagerly. While the horses drank, I scooped water with my hat, taking what would be my last drink for over 24 long hours. Once the horses were watered, we crossed the river, moved through the underbrush, and into the prairie. There, we dismounted to tighten our saddle girths. Within about 10 minutes, we were heading down a long but relatively narrow valley. On our right was the dense, irregularly coursing river, bordered by high bluffs. On our left were low foothills, near which we could see part of the pony herds. As we got closer, we could distinguish mounted men riding in all directions, some in circles, others back and forth. They were gathering their ponies and signaling to each other. At that point, we were moving at a fast walk. Soon, the command to trot was given. As little puffs of smoke appeared and the ping of bullets became audible, we were ordered to charge. Some of the soldiers began to applaud in response to the Indian war whoops, but Major Reno soon screamed, "Stop that noise!" and repeated the command, "Charge! Charge!" The passion in his words caused me to take a momentary backward glance. Major Reno and Lieutenant Hodgson were riding side by side just behind my company. As I glanced back, I saw Major Reno taking a swig from a bottle. He then handed it to Lieutenant Hodgson. It looked like a quart flask, about half or two-thirds full of an amber-colored liquid. There was nothing particularly unusual about this, yet the scene is etched in my memory. I quickly turned my attention back to the front, as there were other pressing matters to focus on. What that flask contained and its effect is not for me to say, but I have always had a strong suspicion. I was number 4 in the morning count-off. This meant that when the army dismounted to fight on foot, every 4th soldier, including myself, was in charge of 3 horses. I wasn't thrilled about this position because I wanted to be in the fight, and I had unsuccessfully tried to trade places with the number 3 man. In hindsight, it might have been fortunate that I didn't succeed. The man I would have swapped with, Cornelius Crowley, had been showing signs of mental instability. The engagement pushed him over the edge, and he had to be managed by the stable guard from then on. Had we exchanged places, and if Crowley had been responsible for 3 other agitated horses, there's no telling if he would have been found when we returned to the woods for our horses. But to continue, the river, as I mentioned earlier, was quite winding. At this point, it curved out into the prairie, made a sharp turn, and then flowed back toward the bluffs. Tall cottonwood trees flanked both sides of the river, and dense underbrush obscured our view of the nearest Indian hamlet, which we were swiftly approaching. We rode over sage and bulberry bushes, prickly pears, and past a prairie dog town with no second thoughts. A glance along the line revealed many determined faces, some perhaps a bit pale, but not solely from fear. The death angel seemed near, possibly marking those who, within the hour, would lie on the prairie or in the woods, dead, stripped, and gashed almost beyond recognition. Regardless, no one flinched. For most of us, this was our first real battle at close range, our baptism of fire. It was a new and strange experience to sit up as human targets, being shot at without returning fire, but our turn was coming. "Halt!" came the sharp, quick order. "Prepare to fight on foot," followed immediately. Every fourth soldier on the right stayed on his saddle, while the others dismounted, tethered their horses together, passed the bridle leads to the fourth man, and charged forward to their positions in the skirmish line. Looking back, the sheer bravado of 150 cavalrymen rushing down on an Indian hamlet populated by at least 2,500 Sioux warriors seemed ridiculous. When we were within close range, we dismounted to fight on foot, leaving a quarter of our men to hold the horses. It indeed seems like madness for 150 men to charge a village of 1,800 lodges. Lieutenant Hare took the led horses into the woods for greater safety, keeping slightly behind the skirmish line. I can't say exactly how long we stayed there, but I firmly believe it was no more than 15 or 20 minutes. During that time, I didn't see Major Reno or hear any commands about what we should do. There was a lot of commotion, and a few shots whistled through the underbrush. Suddenly, the skirmishers came rushing into the woods, frantically looking for their horses, which were hard to locate due to the dense underbrush and a slight change in position. Then I heard a comment, "We need to get out of here immediately." Numbers 1 and 2 in my company of 4 noticed me and immediately took their horses, leaving me with Con Crowley's horse and wondering where he was. I soon noticed him a short distance away, racing about and yelling, "Where's my horse? Where is my horse?" I yelled at him, perhaps not kindly but forcefully, and he dashed at me. I tossed him the bridle rein and turned my horse in the direction I saw the others going. Everything was in complete chaos, and I dismounted and mounted again twice in just a few moments. I did this without really knowing why, probably because I saw others doing it and thought they had orders. Before I had gone very far, I looked to my left and rear and saw quite a number of mounted Indians rushing through the woods in the same general direction we were going, as if they were trying to cut off the men who had gone ahead of me. They were so close that at first I thought they might be some of our Indian scouts, but a second glance quickly dispelled that notion. These Indians were mostly dressed for battle, wearing only a breechcloth, feathers, a whip on their wrist, and a gun in hand. There was one exception. A strong-looking man who was closest to me. He sported a magnificent war bonnet adorned with long feathers that encircled his head and trailed down his back, with some feathers draping alongside his pony. I was tempted to shoot at him, but the dense woods made aiming difficult, and I wasn't a great shooter. Besides, my comrades were eager to get out of there as fast as possible, so I decided to let him be. I've long wondered if he was one of the major leaders such as Gall or Black Moon. Nonetheless, I continued on my way. The underbrush was thick, and as I pushed through it, my right stirrup got caught. The strap that held it to the saddle was practically severed, leaving the stirrup unusable and forcing me to carefully keep my equilibrium. In what seemed like no time at all, I emerged from the woods, climbed a small bank, and reached the prairie not far from where we had initially entered the woods. The scene that met my eyes was incredibly disheartening. Just 200 yards ahead, a growing horde of Indian warriors charged toward us on their swift ponies, whooping and howling. They were known as the finest horsemen and fiercest fighters around, unmatched in our land or any other. They had looped around our left flank, impeding our retreat to the ford where we had crossed the river previously. Now, the closest among them, firing from the opposite side of their ponies, unleashed a devastating barrage upon us. To my left, a line of comrades moved directly eastward towards the bluffs, which were about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile away. At their base flowed the river, its steep banks here covered with dense underbrush. The situation grew dire and sudden. Moments earlier, we had been driving the Indians with great ease, as Reno's report stated. Now we were the ones being driven, but there was no time for reflection. Each man in front of me extended his right arm, firing his revolver into a line of shouting Indians, and I quickly followed. The famed thin red line of the English paled in comparison to the thick growing line of Sioux emerging from the dust clouds. Eager to engage, hundreds more streamed forward, yelling and racing towards us soldiers. For many, including myself, it was our first battle, and for some the first time firing a shot from horseback. As mentioned earlier, my useless right stirrup made my seat insecure and my aim less precise, so I can't claim to have caused much harm. Still, I aimed at an Indian directly across from me who seemed particularly focused on me. In such moments, many thoughts race through one's mind swiftly. The risks of injury or capture were abundant, and one could easily imagine their fate in such a situation. I kept one of the 6 bullets in my revolver as a last resort for myself, though thankfully I didn't need to use it that way. Much of our route was through a prairie dog town, where the various holes and mounds made our fast riding unpleasant. You never knew when your horse might stumble into a hole and throw you off. After a few moments of navigating this terrain, I reached what had once been the riverbed ages ago. The bank was about 3 or 4 feet lower with a rather abrupt drop. With a little urging, my horse jumped down. As he did, I reached for the pommel of my saddle with my right hand, which still held my revolver, to steady myself. In the process, my revolver fell to the ground. The Indians were closing in, later saying they intended to drive us all into the river to drown. Dismounting to look for my handgun amid the dense grass and bushes looked reckless. So, I hurried towards the river, where I saw a struggling mass of men and horses with little streams of blood coloring the water. Among them was Lieutenant Hodgson, who mentioned he'd been wounded. I turned my horse slightly to the right to avoid the crowd, jumped into the river, and was soon across. After a long battle, I ascended the steep bank. My horse was extremely weary from the high pace and effort required to cross the river. He stood shaking from exhaustion and refused to go any farther. He was a poor, broken-winded beast who should have been condemned long ago, but a shortage of mounts made it necessary to take him along. He was assigned to me since I had joined the group late. He was named Steamboat because of the peculiar noise he made when traveling. I dismounted and, amid the whistling bullets, waited for a few moments for him to catch his breath. I then tried to lead him, but he wouldn't budge. Getting behind him, I jabbed him with my gun in vain. Meanwhile, my colleagues surged towards the bluffs, some mounted and some on foot, leading their horses and going over the top. Things looked serious indeed. To be dismounted in the face of hundreds of Sioux warriors just a short distance away was like staring into my grave. In my anger and frustration, I gave the beast a parting kick, unslung my carbine, and started up the bluff. I felt like a target for hundreds of firearms, with small puffs of dust rising from the ground around me as bullets buried themselves in the dry, dusty hill. The slope we were ascending formed a funnel-shaped ridge with narrow, deep ravines on either side that ended just a few yards from the river. It must have been Providence that led us to that particular spot, as there was no other place nearby where we could have made the ascent with such haste and ease. I had gone about a third of the way up when I was overtaken by a dismounted comrade from my old troop, named Myers, whom we called Tinker Bill because he had been a tinner's apprentice before enlisting. We walked closely together for a few feet when, with a single exclamation of, "Oh!" Myers pitched forward face down to the ground. I leaned over him and discovered he was dead, shot between the left ear and eye. I thought it might be my turn next, so instead of heading straight ahead, I veered to the right and moved more into the ravine. Then I turned left again, zigzagging but always moving upward. When I got almost to the summit, Frank Neely, a former M-Troop buddy, passed me. He was mounted and had a led horse with him, which he gladly handed over to me. I felt a deep sense of relief as I got into the saddle again, even though this new mount, named Old Dutch, was not much of an improvement over the one I had left behind. Despite his name implying otherwise, he was still a horse, and I was just glad to have a ride. I mounted and rode over the top of the bluff, where I found the greater part of Reno's command. Soon after, we were joined by a few others who had barely managed to escape. I've often wondered how a man feels when he thinks he's about to die suddenly. Now I knew. Given the large number of Indians and the chaotic situation we encountered while trekking across the valley and up the bluffs, our escape appeared nothing short of miraculous. We were pursued by a howling mass of warriors, naked to the waist, enraged and desperate by the terrified cries of their wives and children, whose lives were in danger for the third time in a few weeks and hurried from their camps, ignoring their own safety, determined to save their families or die trying. To us, with their paint, feathers, and wild, fierce cries, they seemed like fiends incarnate. But were they? The Indian fire and pursuit seemed to cease as soon as we reached the top of the bluffs, for which we were very grateful, although we had no idea why it happened. Major Reno was walking around in an agitated manner. He had lost his hat during the charge and had tied a red handkerchief around his head, giving him a rather odd and unmilitary appearance. Most of the soldiers had collapsed on the ground, completely weary. The policemen were conversing together, comparing notes and so forth. We hadn't been there long when Captain Benteen came with the 3 troops, H, D, and K, who had been dispatched to the left about 2 hours earlier. They were now, following both written and verbal orders, on their way to join Custer. Reno's command joined together at 2:30 p.m., according to Reno. Shortly after, Captain McDougal arrived with B Troop, escorting the pack train, and joined us. Captain McDougal also received an order from General Custer to rush and join him on the pack train. Sergeant David C. Canepe of Captain Tom Custer's Troop C delivered this message to McDougal. It is worth noting that the general's younger brother, Boston Custer, was operating as a civilian forage master. He had been riding with the general that morning, but had returned to the pack train to get a new horse. After acquiring the horse, he set out to rejoin the general's command. On his journey, he came upon Trumpeter Martin, who was delivering a dispatch to Captain Benteen. Mr. Custer and the trumpeter exchanged a few words before continuing on their own routes. Mr. Custer had ample time to rejoin the leadership before the conflict began, and his body was discovered within a few yards from those of his 2 brothers. For over 2 hours after Captain Benteen's command arrived, we remained on the bluff without any disturbances. The first sergeants of Reno's 3 troops went about checking on the soldiers to see how many had been killed, injured, or missing, as well as taking inventory of lost government goods. We heard gunshots in the approximate direction that Custer was supposed to have gone. "Why don't we move?" was a question many asked. Although the 3 troops engaged in the valley were somewhat demoralized, that wasn't a valid reason for the entire command to remain inactive. A handful of our men were injured, but none so badly that they could not ride with the pack train. All the officers must have known that Custer was engaged with the Indians and was likely nearby since he hadn't had time to go far. The sudden withdrawal of the strong force of Indians who had driven us away from their camp could only mean one thing: another attack on their camp, real or threatened by a force from another direction. In the late afternoon, about 4:30, a squad of 12 of our colleagues was observed ascending the bluffs. Some had become dismounted in the woods, or just outside when the command left, and had remained hidden until the Indians seemed to have left the area. Once it seemed safe, they emerged and began moving in the direction Reno had taken. Initially, there were 14 in the group, but 2 refused to risk escaping in daylight and stayed behind, eventually discovered and killed by the Indians. The escaping party included George Herendeen, a scout, 6 soldiers from G Troop, 3 from M Troop, and 2 from A Troop. Along the way, they encountered 5 Indians, whom they drove off without trouble or loss. After crossing the river, which was waist-deep, one of the men from a troop found and recognized my horse grazing where I had left it. He brought the horse along, later returning it to me, thinking I had been killed. Remarkably, none of my equipment or belongings were missing, even though the horse had been near, if not within, the Indian line for nearly 3 hours. I should mention that another group of our men also stayed hidden in the woods, unseen and unknown to the first party. Lieutenant DeRudio, Private Tom O'Neill of G Troop, Frank Gerard, the Ree Scouts translator, and William Jackson, a half-breed scout, comprised the second party. After many close calls and an absence of about 34 hours, they reached our lines late in the evening of the 26th. In total, 18 men were known to have been left behind during the charge. It's likely there were several others who didn't manage to escape. We got orders to meet shortly after the group of 12 guys returned, about 5 o'clock. Mounting our horses, we headed in the direction where Custer was thought to have gone. A quick ride along the bluffs, which obscured our view of the Indian hamlet, took us to a hill with a partial view of what was eventually recognized as Custer's battlefield. We spotted numerous Indians in the distance, with others closer by. Before long, they started moving towards us, and Captain Weir's advance troop came under attack. The entire command received orders to retreat, and we returned to the position we had vacated shortly before. By then, the Indians had completely surrounded us and unleashed a fierce barrage of gunfire. The pack train, wounded men, and horses were positioned in a low area between two ridges, while the men were spread out on top of the ridges, lying close to the ground. In my estimation, this was around 6 o'clock, consistent with Major Reno's report. Captain Godfrey suggests it might have been slightly later, but I believe he is mistaken. It didn't take us 2 hours to return the about 1 mile distance to our starting place, especially considering the haste prompted by the approaching Sioux, whom we now held in much greater esteem than previously. 2 sizable ridges sloped down from the steep bluffs overlooking the river, forming a hollow where our horses and wounded found some shelter. However, we were constantly under fire from the east at long range. Those assigned to guard the horses lay flat on the ground, eagerly anticipating nightfall after a day filled with intense danger that unnerved both seasoned veterans and new recruits alike. Reflecting on our position on that hill in later years and considering the generally disorganized state of our command, I've often wondered why the formidable force of Indians, which had swiftly overwhelmed Custer and his 5 troops in such a short time, hesitated to employ the tactics that had secured their earlier victory. It was incredibly fortunate for us that they chose not to press their advantage further. The Indians shot continuously until nightfall, then sometimes after that until 9 o'clock at night when they finally stopped. We hadn't suffered many losses since moving onto the hillside, Captain Godfrey observed. Personally, I knew of only 3 killed and a few others wounded. Scouts were dispatched to look for Custer's soldiers as dusk fell. They quickly went back and reported that there were too many Indians in the area. A trumpeter was dispatched to a little elevation to play some cries in the hopes that they would reach Custer's command and direct them to our position. The trumpeter turned to face Custer and gave a furious performance of 3 or 4 calls, the last of which I believe was taps, the call that is generally played after tattoo to indicate that lights out and also heard during a soldier's burial. Was it merely chance that led the trumpeter to send out the notes of lights out into the still night air? As the echoes faded into the darkness, a deep sadness washed over us. Nearby, fresh and shallow graves marked where some of our fallen comrades had been hastily buried by their peers that afternoon. There was no ceremony, just a small trench right where they fell, covered with a few inches of earth, destined to be washed away by the first rain. In the valley, near the woods and along the steep hillside lay others from our command, unburied, men who had fallen during that chaotic retreat. Even further away, though we did not know it at the time, were the mangled remains of over 200 of our regiment. It seems most fitting now that taps was blown then, perhaps unthinkingly, but so appropriately. No one answered the call, which worried us. The personal loss of close comrades, the great disaster to our regiment, and our own narrow escape had a profoundly sobering effect on all of us. Here comes a rather peculiar incident, one that some might question but which I swear is entirely true. After the Indian fire had completely ceased, the men, relieved from the terrible strain of the last few hours, moved about freely and were naturally anxious to know what our next move would be. With the first sergeant of Company A wounded, his duties fell to Sergeant Filer, an elderly German with a rather calm demeanor. Our company was dispersed, and I noticed Sergeant Filer toward the lower end of the herded horses and load mules. I approached him and inquired what we were going to do. Stay here all night or attempt to get away? Major Reno, who was standing close, heard my query. He swung around fast and said, "I want to know how in the hell we're going to escape." I was surprised by his remarks and tone, but I had some ideas, so I told Sergeant Filer, "The Indians will be at our location first thing in the morning, so if we choose to stay, we need construct a barrier." Major Reno, still listening, promptly responded. Sergeant Filer immediately started to urge the soldiers to gather boxes of hardtack, pack saddles, sides of bacon, dead mules, and horses, anything they could find. and form a barrier across the bottom section of the depression. This was eventually accomplished, but only after much coaxing and pleading by the sergeant. Surprisingly, many of the soldiers, and especially the commanders, showed little enthusiasm in their task. The only excuse I can offer for this seeming indifference is that they likely expected General Custer to appear during the night, making our labor pointless. That barricade proved invaluable the next day, undoubtedly saving the lives of many men who were quick to seek its protection from the relentless fire that hit us the following morning. It commanded the only viable strategy for a mounted attack against our lines. When the Indians attempted to charge us the next day, they met such a strong resistance from the start that they abandoned the idea. Without that barricade, I firmly believe they would have ridden over us as they did over Custer's men. I'm not sure if companies M, K, B, and D made any special efforts to fortify their positions at that time, but I saw no evidence of it, and I know that Troop H did not. Soon after our barricade was completed, around 10 p.m., I was assigned to picket guard duty. There were 6 privates and 1 corporal, Stanislaus Roy, all from Troop A. We advanced about 300 yards down the slope in front of our breastworks, quickly posting 2 sentinels, one on the right and the other about 100 yards to the left. A short distance in front of us were 2 hillocks about 50 yards apart, obstructing our view behind them. These hillocks were employed that afternoon and the next day as prime targets for any of our guys who dared to reveal themselves. I was assigned to the second shift, giving me a chance to sleep for 2 hours before my turn. Before lying down, I carefully examined the landscape in front of me, paying particular attention to the taller sagebrush that could be mistaken for the stealthy approach of an Indian in the dark. Confident that I had a good sense of the surroundings, I lay down and quickly fell into a deep, untroubled sleep, which we all desperately needed after having so little rest the previous night. It seemed like a very short 2 hours when I was woken to replace the first guard, who properly reported that everything was well. I took a slightly different position than the last sentinel and sat down to observe, since walking would have made me more visible. The sounds of shouting and drums from the Indian camps were still audible. It had been a day of intense excitement, desperate struggle, and ultimate triumph, unlike any they had experienced before. The soldiers' sudden appearance at the edge of their camp, the warriors rallying to defend their homes, and the defeat of the white men, with over 200 lying dead on the plains and hills nearby, attested to the Indians' prowess. Horses, saddles, blankets, more than 200 carbines, as many revolvers, ammo, cash, and a variety of clothes were among the numerous items they had taken. Indeed, there was much to be glad about and celebrated. However, it was not all exultation. Many lodges held the lifeless bodies of husbands and fathers who had bravely ridden out just hours before to defend their families and homes. In other tepees, some lay helpless from serious wounds, some nearing death, facing their fate with the stoic indifference typical of their race. For those who were dead, there were loud lamentations and sincere wailing, as was their custom. At one point during the night, amidst the savage yells and discordant noise of the Indian drums, we heard the sound of a bugle, which brought us all to our feet at once. Our first thought was that Custer was finally coming. We listened again, and the bugle notes were a bit more distinct this time. However, it wasn't an army call I recognized, though some claimed it was. One thing was clear. It came from the camp of our foes below us. As if to mock our budding hopes, the beating of the drums intensified, and the wolf-like yells grew louder. We quickly realized what had happened. We remembered that one of the trumpeters from G Troop had been killed during our retreat, and the Indians had undoubtedly taken his bugle, using it to amuse themselves and add to the general din. The idea that there were probably 8 or 10 more bugles in the Indian camp, taken from Custer's 5 troops, each troop having 2, hadn't even crossed our minds. Several theories have been debated over the years regarding this bugle incident. One theory suggests that a half-breed or Indian who may have had previous contact with a trumpeter at an army post and learned to mimic some calls could have been involved. According to a different account, one of Custer's trumpeters may have been forced or permitted to play the bugle before meeting his demise after being taken prisoner by the Indians. To me, the most plausible explanation remains the first one mentioned. My 2 hours of duty went rather fast, the sounds of the drums and yells coming from the Indian encampment getting softer. Apart from the occasional mournful howl of a prairie wolf in the direction Custer had taken, there was little else to be heard. When the third relief arrived, I reported, "All's well," and once again sought the soldier's bed, the rough and hard ground, where I soon fell fast asleep as before. As expected, I woke up early in the morning again. Around 3 o'clock, as the light began to grow, 2 rifle shots rang out from a nearby low ridge. This seemed to signal the Indians to open fire, as within moments a barrage of bullets came from all along their line. The corporal didn't need to tell us twice to retreat to our lines. We moved quickly and upon reaching our position, took cover behind the breastworks that now proved their worth. Other than the bulk of a troop, which was manning this defensive line, our party consisted of a few civilian packers and a few stragglers from other troops. At one point during the day, I noticed an officer whose company was stationed elsewhere on the field, facing even greater danger than ours, finding safety behind the sturdiest part of our breastworks. From the moment the Indians opened fire early in the morning until late forenoon, it was perilous for anyone to raise their head above the barricade. The Indians didn't maintain a constant barrage, likely due to the expense of their ammunition. However, any attempt to stand or expose even a small part of the body drew a hail of bullets. These shots didn't always find their mark, as illustrated by the following incident. Captain Benteen, despite later criticism for his response to Custer's orders, showed exceptional bravery throughout. His troop was, as I understand it, situated a few hundred yards south of our breastworks on a ridge. They hadn't dug trenches or taken other precautions against the incoming fire, something Captain Benteen, a seasoned soldier, must have known would come the next morning. Consequently, due to their exposed position, they suffered significant casualties. Reports vary, but one account mentions 10 wounded and 3 killed outright. In response, Captain Benteen approached our line and requested materials from Captain Moylan's barricade, which was longer than necessary for the men it sheltered. Throughout this period, Captain Benteen remained clearly visible to the Indians, showing no inclination to seek cover. Bullets kicked up dust all around him, yet he moved calmly, almost as if on parade, down to our lines. After completing his task, he returned in the same composed manner, even measuring with a carbine the distance from his foot to where a bullet had recently struck the ground less than 2 feet away. I vividly remember this incident because I was within the same firing zone, standing just a short distance from him at the time. I ran up the slope carrying a box of hardtack, part of the crew sent to supply supplies for Benteen's breastworks. It was a tense moment, and when a bullet slammed into the box, nearly knocking it off, I had serious doubts about completing the trip, however short it was. In spite of this, I made it to my destination safely. As we returned to our own company, we circled around to the rear, finding a slightly less exposed position. I had just settled back into my place behind the works when the man beside me on the left, whom I could almost touch without moving, raised his head slightly to take a shot. Suddenly, a bullet hit him right between the eyes, killing him instantly and without any agony. He didn't utter a sound or make any movement. This man was Frank Mann, one of the citizen packers known for his continuous firing without clear cause or effect. He had been warned to avoid exposing himself so much, but the caution went unheeded, and he was eventually targeted by an Indian sharpshooter, ending his life abruptly. Shortly after, another comrade and I moved the body a few feet away, as its presence between us was unsettling. Since I had lost my own revolver, I took the one carried by the packer, a government-issued weapon that was no longer of use to him, but could prove invaluable to me at any moment. Life seemed precarious throughout that eventful day, as such close brushes with death are deeply unsettling. I believe most of the soldiers shared the feeling that unless Providence intervened, our fate seemed grim. In the morning, Captain Benteen crossed over to the north side where Major Reno was stationed and requested reinforcements. He feared an imminent Indian charge on his position, as only one troop, H, was left to defend the southern line. If the Indians attacked, they could easily overwhelm Captain Benteen's men and catch the rest of us in a crossfire. After some persuasion, Reno finally ordered Captain French to bring his troop, M, over to reinforce the southern side. Benteen ordered a charge shortly after M Troop arrived, and it was effective in driving the Indians back from their position almost all the way to the river. Several soldiers were wounded, but only one, Private Tanner of M Troop, was seriously injured. He fell partway down the hill during the charge. He was immediately hurried down the slope by a number of his colleagues, who covered him with a blanket and, in the face of intense fire, dragged him back to the lines where he died soon after. The gunfire would intermittently quiet down only to erupt again with increased intensity. By noon, however, it began to subside, prompting a call for volunteers to fetch water from the river, which we had been without for many hours. Many suffered from intense thirst, though I doubt there was much real suffering aside from some of the wounded. Still, enduring 24 hours without water, especially on a hot June day with a river flowing nearby, and the distant snow-capped Bighorn Mountains visible to the southwest, was far from pleasant. We had tried all sorts of things to quench our thirst, such as holding stones in our mouths and chewing on the lead from bullets and the insides of prickly pear leaves, but they had all been ineffective, if not annoying. When volunteers were called for, there was a quick and enthusiastic response. Covered by some of Benteen's best sharpshooters at the front, a group carrying camp kettles and canteens navigated a ravine that led close to the river. They made a daring dash, reached the river, filled the kettles, and hurried back to the safety of the ravine to refill the canteens. Indians positioned nearby on the opposite bank immediately opened fire as soon as the men were spotted, turning the task into a perilous endeavor. Several men were wounded, with one requiring such severe medical attention that his leg had to be amputated. This unlucky person was K Troop's saddler, Michael Madden. At the time, this mission struck me as unnecessary and ill-advised given the circumstances. The near certainty of losing 5 or 6 men at a crucial moment when every able-bodied person capable of firing a gun was needed seemed, in my view, unjustifiable. In the next hour or two, most of the Indians seemed to withdraw. However, I believe this was a ploy, their final attempt to catch us off guard, because around 2 o'clock they resumed firing and drove us back to our shelters. This renewed attack didn't last long. After a while, the gunfire stopped altogether. Later, they started a fire in the grassy area below, and soon after, a large group of Indians could be seen moving up the valley towards the Bighorn Mountains. It was a tremendous relief for us, as we had endured nearly 2 days under intense stress, and I doubt if there ever was a more worn-out and haggard-looking group of men in Army blue than the dwindling survivors of the once proud 7th. Major Reno moved our position closer to the river as dusk was falling. The men were put to work digging trenches in anticipation of further fighting, and also to escape the growing stench from the dead men and horses, which had become quite offensive. There was less need for persuasion now. The men had learned their lesson, and within a few hours we had constructed some fairly decent trenches. The one I helped with was circular and could accommodate 6 to 8 men. Our tools were tin cups and plates, knives, makeshift paddles crafted from hardtack boxes, and a few shovels. With our nerves finally relaxing and our bodies exhausted, we stretched out on the bare ground for the first solid night's rest since the 23rd. Sometime during the night, 4 of our missing comrades appeared in 2 separate groups. They had been left behind in the valley like many others during Reno's retreat and were fortunate to find us. Since 2 p.m. on the 25th, they had been holed up in the riverbank woods close to the Indians who were coming and going from our beleaguered positions. On Tuesday morning, June 27th, we rose early and peacefully enjoyed our breakfast of bacon, hardtack, and coffee. Our horses drank eagerly, seeming insatiable, while we washed our faces and hands and tidied ourselves up. There was no sign of Indians, no shots prompting us to take cover. Major Reno was resolute in staying put, keeping the men prepared to occupy the pits if the Indians returned. Around mid-morning, a cloud of dust appeared downstream, raising our anticipation of renewed conflict. Horses were secured, water was fetched, and we awaited the arrival of whatever approached. Soon, a scout arrived bearing a note from General Terry to General Custer. Shortly after, Lieutenant Bradley of the Montana Column and his scout detachment arrived, bringing with them the first news of the tragic disaster that had befallen Custer's command. We had hoped the dust cloud signaled their arrival, but instead, it brought sobering news. However, it turned out to be the Montana Column, accompanied by General Terry, who along with General Gibbon and several other officers soon joined us. According to Captain Godfrey, their arrival was met with prolonged cheers. The solemn presence of General Terry silenced the men, and as officers gathered to greet their guests, there were few dry eyes and little conversation. Quivering lips and heartfelt handshakes expressed both gratitude for the relief and sorrow for the losses. General Gibbon's troops arrived shortly after and set up camp in the valley nearly opposite our position. Lieutenant Coolidge, with his background in medicine, was assigned to assist Dr. Porter in tending to our 52 injured. It was difficult to move the seriously wounded, some of whom were defenseless. They had to be carried in blankets down a precipitous bluff and through a river that was almost waist deep. Despite the difficulties, the men handled the task with care and consideration. It must have been a tremendous relief for the wounded when they were safely settled in their new field hospital, a grassy bed shielded from the sun by a makeshift tent. The remainder of the day was dedicated to gathering our belongings, disposing of any surplus items that could be useful to the Indians, such as bacon and hardtack, and dismantling the barricade to reclaim useful materials. Additionally, we attended to the humane task of putting down several badly wounded horses and mules. Later in the day, I ventured over to the front of Benteen's position, where just down the slope lay the body of a brave warrior who had attempted to count coup on one of Benteen's men. I had witnessed many daring acts during the battle, but now I beheld the aftermath of one such act. Only 2 such incidents remained visible on our battlefield, one near the ford where we ascended the bluff, and this one. In a small hollow there lay sprawled a strong Sioux warrior, completely unclothed except for a loincloth and moccasins. His head faced uphill, his right arm pointed towards where the fatal shot had originated, his face bearing a grim look of defiance, devoid of the typical war paint of yellow, green, and crimson, often seen on others. Maybe he hadn't taken the time to apply it in his rush to get into the fight. He had been scalped by a soldier, a fate believed by his people to annihilate his soul, denying him access to the happy hunting ground. Never had I seen such a perfect example of physical strength. He appeared to be about 30 years old, standing nearly 6 feet tall with impressive proportions. He resembled a bronze statue that had been toppled to the ground, a figure that sculpted. A wave of sadness overcame me as I stood there. He lay just a short distance from his home and family, whom we had sought to destroy, and he had fought and died defending them. Meanwhile, his killer's home was likely 1,000 miles away. In the days to come, wolves and vultures would likely tear apart and scatter his remains, as the soldiers showed no inclination to bury a fallen Indian, and his family and tribe were already in retreat. I later discovered his name was High Elk. His medicine bag, the only possession he had left, I kept as a memento of a courageous man in a historic battle. It hung from a belt, crafted from the leather of a bootleg, shaped like a pistol cartridge box, and sewn with fine wire, its flap adorned with brass tacks. Inside were 3 small packets of different colored dry paint, each wrapped in soft buckskin, along with a piece of dry flag root, part of a coarse comb, a few matches, and some thread needles. Ever since then, I've always wondered if years later, the administrator of Custer National Cemetery will discover his weathered and scattered bones. Maybe they would think these were Reno's command remains that were missed in the first interment. They may have collected them and buried them with the people they had battled against. Shortly after 5 o'clock on the morning of the 28th, the remaining members of our regiment mounted up once more and bid farewell to that unforgettable location and the scattered graves of our fallen comrades. It had been our enforced camp for 2.5 days, and much of that time, it seemed like our journey on earth might end there. We departed, carrying with us indelible memories of those intense moments when we faced death for hours on end. Our mission now was to find our comrades who had fallen with Custer and give them a brief and hurried burial as a final tribute. After riding a short distance north, perhaps a little more than 1.5 miles, we reached a rise where we could glimpse part of the battlefield. It was a stark, desolate place, where besides some coarse grass, only wild sage and prickly pear cacti grew abundantly. An aura of sadness and desolation hung over it, which was hardly surprising. Just hours earlier, every soul on that bloody field had cast anxious glances and prayers in vain for our arrival, which could have meant the salvation of many lives. The real battlefield was located about a mile distant, mostly along a ridge that ran almost exactly parallel to the river. It was maybe half a mile broad and less than a mile long. Most of the bodies lay on the slope of this ridge, although many were scattered between the river and the ridge itself, appearing stark white from a distance like small mounds of snow. The command split up, with each troop or detachment assigned a specific section of the field. Commanding Officer Major Reno made sure that Lieutenant Varnum and his surviving scouts were deployed far out on the flanks to avoid any possible surprises. Unfortunately, we had very few tools for digging graves, just one spade per company, brought along by the company cook for cutting a trench to build his fire. Consequently, it was impossible to provide a proper burial for over 200 bodies in the limited time available. The best we could manage was to cover the remains with branches of sagebrush and sprinkle a bit of earth over them, enough to preserve their dignity momentarily. However, this makeshift covering would likely be undone within hours by wind and rain, and the mournful howls of wolves, already audible, would scatter their bones across the surrounding ground. Sergeant Butler, a soldier in Lieutenant Calhoun's company's L Troop, who was renowned for his valor and war experience with the Indians, was recognized as the first body found. Reliable maps showed that he was located close to the foot of a hill, about a mile from Custer's fall site, and little over a mile straight ahead from Major Reno's position. His body was bare and a little disfigured, but not as much as some others. Based on accounts from an Indian who participated in the battle, Sergeant Butler's reputation, and the circumstances surrounding his discovery, it appears likely that soon after the battle commenced, General Custer chose him to attempt reaching Captain Benteen and urging his swift reinforcement as the situation was growing dire. He took the message and hurried back at a swift pace, covering considerable ground before the surprised Indians made any attempt to intercept him. Perhaps he got away, but he was climbing a ridge when he saw some Indians appear at the top, approaching from Reno's location. With enemies both behind and in front of him, Sergeant Butler had no chance. He was in the crosshairs of the chasing team as bullets flew perilously near. Escape became impossible. He leaped from his horse, unslung his carbine, and the presence of several expended cartridge shells beside his body testified to his valiant struggle. His creed was clear: duty without faltering, strength unwavering, fidelity unto death. None of the bodies I saw were clothed, and nearly all bore gruesome mutilations. This was the grim reality across the battlefield, with few exceptions noted. General Custer and Captain Keogh were mentioned as exceptions, though I did not personally witness them. The scenes that morning were more horrific than anything depicted by the great Russian artist Tatkolev in his war horrors paintings. Heads smashed beyond recognition by stone war clubs, limbs slashed with sharp knives, bodies dismembered, and many still pierced by arrows. There was nothing left on the field, man or horse, that I could see. Everything had been swept clean by the squaws. The sagebrush, crushed and trampled by the horses and ponies of both sides, emitted a strong odor. Mixed with the stench of bloated, decaying bodies of men and horses, it was sickening. Yet some were so hardened or indifferent that I witnessed men sitting near mutilated corpses, calmly eating their hardtack and bacon. Several officers rode swiftly across the battlefield, examining various bodies in hopes of identifying the 3 missing lieutenants: Harrington, Porter, and young Jimmy Sturgis, the latter being the colonel's son and recently graduated from West Point. Their search proved futile, although they went so far as to check the hands of a body near me, hoping to find a clue from an uncalloused palm. This body, like the others, was naked and had several arrows in it, 2 of which I removed and kept. In the deserted Indian camp, some of young Sturgis's name-brand apparel was found. However, his body was never recovered or identified, despite claims suggesting otherwise. Lieutenant Nolan from I Troop of the 7th, serving on General Terry's staff at the time, reportedly marked the graves of many officers by driving stakes into the ground, topped with empty cartridge shells containing the names of those they were meant to memorialize. I did not witness this myself, nor does First Sergeant John Ryan of M Troop confirm it. I had 4 years of service with Sergeant Ryan, and he writes to me, "Despite being fully nude, General Custer's physique revealed no evidence of trauma. He had been shot twice. 1 bullet entered his right side and passed almost through, while the second, likely fatal, went through his head from near the right ear to near the left. Beneath his body were found 4 or 5 brass cartridge shells, which, along with a lock of his hair, were later sent to his widow. Identifying Captain Tom Custer's body was extremely challenging. He was found about 10 to 15 feet from General Custer, and his remains were severely mutilated. His body had been split down the center with cuts through the muscles of his arms and thighs. His throat was slashed and his head was badly crushed, lying face down when discovered. Sergeant Ryan recalled seeing the letters TWC tattooed in India ink on one of Captain Custer's forearm during his tenure as First Lieutenant of M Troop in 1873. Despite the arm being cut and somewhat discolored, a careful search confirmed the presence of the letters, thus confirming his identity. 2 bodies could fit in the grave that Sergeant Ryan and his crew excavated, which was about 18 inches deep and broad. Before being buried, General Custer and his brother, Captain T.W. Custer, were covered in blankets and the remains of a shelter tent. After covering them with a layer of earth, they placed an upside-down Indian travois basket over the grave and secured it with stones along the edges to deter wolves from disturbing it. This concluded the burial of General Custer. Sergeant Ryan's crew only buried Lieutenant W. W. Cook's body. One of his long black side whiskers, which had been cut off as a scalp, served as a distinguishing feature. The lieutenant, as I remember, had a small patch of baldness. As the regimental adjutant, Lieutenant Cook had long been a close personal friend of General Custer. I've always found it odd that General Custer's remains weren't brought along with the wounded and taken on the steamer far west to Fort Lincoln. There were enough supplies like salt and strong canvas available to properly preserve his body, and the steamer was just a short distance away. The Indians took away many of their dead. Why couldn't the white men do the same for someone as prominent as General Custer? The enlisted soldiers at the time harbored a strong sense of animosity toward General Custer, whether it was deserved or not. It's unclear to me how widespread this feeling was among the officers, both senior and junior. Among the soldiers, there was a belief that their comrades had been sacrificed unnecessarily and their own lives endangered to fulfill personal ambitions. As more details about the battle and the circumstances emerged later, this sentiment among the men underwent significant changes. After completing our solemn task, the unit regrouped and headed towards the ford where the Indians had crossed, planning to travel through the abandoned campsites of the Indians towards General Terry's camp, which was partly situated where Major Reno had launched his attack. It wasn't until then that we fully grasped the scale of the forces we had faced. Stretched along the river for miles, following its twists and turns and extending into the prairie, were numerous lodge sites. According to reports from Terry's engineer officer, there were around 1,800 of them, a figure I've never doubted. As we rode, the signs of a hurried departure were everywhere. Countless lodge poles, robes, tanned hides, pots, kettles, cups, pans, axes, and various other items. Among these were several ornate box-like containers made of rawhide resembling traveling trunks. There were also sleeping mats woven from small willow sticks that rolled up like porch shades. We found several war clubs, some still bearing disturbing signs of recent use. We hadn't traveled far when we spotted a cavalry horse among the bushes near the river. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche, a claybank with a sorrel hue. The horse had been stripped of all gear and presented a pitiful sight, bearing no fewer than 7 wounds from bullets and arrows, some of which were still bleeding. Even on parts of his mane untouched by wounds, there were traces of dried blood, likely from Captain Keogh himself. Having been wounded once previously in another Indian war while serving under Captain Keogh's command, Comanche appeared to have Before departing from this site, which marks one of the greatest victories in our history against the Indians, I must recount one more incident related to it. We saw 2 or 3 smoke signals on the hills west of the Indian settlement for a considerable amount of time on the late afternoon of the 25th, when we were besieged on the bluffs. These signals didn't draw much attention from our command, as no one understood their significance at the time. They were only signals of some sort, Indian to us. They appeared as tall, straight columns of smoke, varying in color intensity from light to dark. It wasn't until much later that we learned the true meaning and significance of these signals. Little did we realize at the time that word of our battle was spreading to all corners, reaching every Sioux camp and warrior across the region. Unbelievable as it sounds, It's likely true that news of the defeat of a large military force at the Little Bighorn was known to the agency Indians along the Missouri River and elsewhere many days before the white settlers had any hint of Custer's demise. The vessel Far West arrived at Bismarck on July 5th, delivering word of Custer's final fight and wounded, but it took more than 9 days for the outside world to get its first reports, starting on the afternoon of June 25th. Even before the Far West's arrival, suspicions of a serious military incident brewed at Fort Lincoln for several days. Indian scouts at the post showed signs of knowing something significant had occurred. Similar indications were observed to an even greater extent at Standing Rock Agency, located about 60 miles south of Fort Lincoln. Lieutenant J.B. Rodman, serving as regimental adjutant with the 20th Infantry at Fort Snelling near St. Paul, Minnesota, approximately 435 miles from Bismarck, received news on July 3rd, around the time the steamer Far West departed from the mouth of the Bighorn River with our wounded. An elderly Sioux Indian, whom the lieutenant had often helped, informed him that a major battle had occurred between soldiers and Indians at the Greasy Grass, Little Bighorn. The battle lasted 2 days, resulting in casualties among both soldiers and chiefs, with more soldiers expected. The Indian community where the informant lived in Mendota was well aware of the events and celebrated with dances and songs. Lieutenant Rodman dismissed the story outright, considering his informant either a fantasist or a liar. However, 48 hours later, on Wednesday morning, the steamer Far West docked at Bismarck, Dakota, and news of the disaster spread rapidly across the country via telegraph. Shortly after this news reached Fort Snelling, the old Indian was summoned again and asked how his community at Mendota had known about the battle 48 hours before the telegraph could inform the wider public. The elderly blind Indian explained that Indians communicated swiftly through runners, signals using mirrors, fire arrows, and smoke, methods that spread news among them faster than even the swiftest pony could travel.